The next tool we're going to look at is our painting tool. So we're going to go over to our terrain component, select on the paintbrush image right here. This is to paint on the terrain. And down below, we see that not too much has changed. We get a couple of things that changed, but not much. And this is a nice thing that once you learn this tool, there's only a few things that you have to relearn for the different types of brushes. The main thing at the top, the brush types, these don't change. We're still able to access these brush types. Below that, we now have changed to textures, and it says no terrain textures are defined. That's because we haven't actually loaded any textures into this tool to work with on our terrain. Below that, our settings are pretty much the same, a little bit different. We have a brush size, which is the size of the brush, the opacity of the brush, again, the strength of it, and the target strength, which we have set to 1. Now let's go ahead and load in some textures. If you look over here, we have a button for Edit Textures. We're going to press on the Edit Textures, and then we're going to do our Add Texture. And then in our Add Terrain Texture window, we're going to go in, and then we're going to look for a splat. Now the splat is just a 2D texture. We're going to be tiling a texture on our terrain. So let's go ahead and left-click on the Texture 2D. And inside of our assets, we're going to be choosing a texture that we actually want to work with. So let's go ahead and say good dirt. We have a good dirt one. Let's increase the size of this just a little bit to make this easier to look at. We've got a good dirt. That one looks pretty good. We'll double click on that one. We can say the number of times that we actually want to tile this, and if we want to offset the tiling, we can offset our tiling. 15 is a pretty good range for right now. We'll go ahead and add that one. When we add it, because it's the first texture that we have, it's going to be tiling that texture across all of the terrain. It's also going to show us the texture right in here. These are going to be the texture samples that we work with. If we zoom in a little bit, we can see this texture a little clearer. Let's go ahead and turn our texture view off. And there we go. You can see that texture in there. Let's go ahead and load in another texture. We're going to do Edit Texture. We're going to add a texture. We're going to go back into our splat, and we're going to do another texture. We'll do a cliff texture. And the 15 by 15 is pretty good. I would suggest experimenting with this a little bit so you get an idea of how many times it's tiling that texture. If you have a really large texture, the tileable image is large and needs to be tiled more, then you're going to want to increase this value. If you're going to want less tiling, then you're going to have to decrease this value. So we're going to add that in there. And when we add that in there, we can see our image here and our image here. Depending on what we have selected is what we're actually going to be using for our brush. So I'm going to select on the cliff, and then we're going to find a little spot in here that we want to paint on. We're going to decrease the size of our brush by just a little bit, and we're going to left click inside the environment. And as we left click in there, it's simply going to paint on the texture. It's removing that texture from the top, and it's showing us the cliff texture that we have selected. If we zoom in a little bit, we can see that cliff texture right there. Now let's say we want additional textures. We can go back into our Edit Texture, Add Texture, and let's go back in and choose something a little bit different. Let's do the grass and rock. And we'll change up the size on this one. Let's change this up to about, say, a 5 and a 5. We'll add that. Select on that texture. That becomes the texture that we paint inside of our environment. And there we go. So easy enough to get in there, assign the different textures that you want, the number of times that you're going to tile that texture, and then working just back and forth between the different textures to create what it is you need for your environment. Additionally, you can go in and use the Edit Textures to edit the texture that you're on, or even remove the texture entirely from the list. Now when you remove it from the list, it also removes it from the environment here. To edit one of the textures, you can go the Edit Texture, and then you could reset the tile size for the X and Y if you wanted. So if we wanted this something, let's say a 30 and a 30, you can see inside of the environment as we increase and decrease that size, we're increasing that size of that image. And let's say we take this down to a, say all the way up to a 128. by 128. There we go. We'll apply that. So depending on just the textures that you're bringing in, you may or may not need to decrease or increase that size to make it match your environment. And that's going to finish off our terrain texturing. In our additional examples and videos, we're going to look at using the terrain tools and additional scripts to create some really nice, solid environments. But for now, we're going to settle for a simple little mountain with some sand and some rocks.